While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast. Sleep. We mention it all the time on the podcast, how important it is for detoxification, recovery from workouts, but it affects every facet of our lives. So I wanted to bring in a subject matter expert. Her name is Miss Mollie Eastman. Welcome to the show, Mollie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So the name of your business is Sleep is a Skill, correct?
Correct.
And what prompted your interest in sleep? Did you have issues with sleep yourself in the past?
Yeah, I absolutely did. And I think it can be pertinent to the listener to like part of my story. I hope can serve as a reference point for people. So what I mean by that is that today I think of my life really in a 3-part series. I think of it as what life looked like before I went through what really was a sleep breakdown. It was this acute period of insomnia and one of the lowest points of my life, what that looked like during, and then what life looked like thereafter. And so the before was a lot of labels and narratives around my sleep. So I would say lots of things about my sleep, like I'm a short sleeper, I'm a night owl, it's in my genes, I'll sleep when I'm dead, all of these things that were just as if these are the cards that I was dealt. It's a fixed reality and it's just something to survive. And I think many people can have some relationship or in some way, shape, or form that could resemble that with their sleep. And so from that place, I got those sort of results. And life looked like that when I was even as a kid, the last person to fall asleep at the sleepover, going into teenage years, college, early 20s, etc. As my life went on, my behaviors became more and more pronounced as a serial entrepreneur in Manhattan, burning the candle at both ends, the kind of, blessing and a curse to be able to make my own hours. What ended up happening was getting more and more pronounced on these maladaptive habits. And I wasn't correlating the ill effects with my health and as having anything to do with my sleep. And so some of the things that looked like was I got an ulcer, I had shingles in my 20s, I had anxiety, issues with my cycle, lots of things that were pointing to how I'm managing my health and well-being is not working. And yet I wasn't really factoring in sleep into that equation. And then it wasn't until I went through this period of acute insomnia that I had never experienced in my life. And it felt at some of its worst, there were times where the sun would be setting and then my heart would start racing and I would start fearing the night. And really, so this can go in that bucket of sleep anxiety. And I would fear another night of, just staring at the ceiling, but not just because you don't want to deal with it, because I truly felt like I was starting to lose my mind. And it was a very scary time, right? And I was also fearful of all of this because I have a family of a lot of history of mental health issues. And of course, we know sleep and mental health being so interconnected. So this was a big moment for me of like, is this the moment where, now I'm going to be destined to be on different types of medications or what have you to do what you would think would be, a given thing. So at one of the lowest points, I went to the doctors, left with sleeping pills. And, just in case anyone is hearing this, that is not supposed to be first line treatment in the United States. It is now supposed to be CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia at least. But unfortunately, some of these things still happen. And that was the case for me, was leaving with pills to address this problem. And in that moment, it was kind of this feeling of, okay, I got to get up under this and take this on. And so ensued sort of this quest to figure out what does it take to get sleep, not just for fun, but because I was felt suddenly like I have to get this handled. And I spent a lot of time, energy, effort, money, the whole world of it. Found a lot of things that didn't work. And then over time, actually began to restore my sleep, but not just to how it was before, which wasn't that great, but actually now to experience what could go in the category of optimized sleep or sleep that I didn't think was available to me. And this was like a whole new experience of life that so fundamentally changed how I related to life, to actually wake up and feel rested. I didn't even think that was on the table for me. So I couldn't stop talking about it. And then as a result, then these small groups kind of started forming, and then Sleep as a Skill got created. Now, on the other side of this, we have the #2 sleep podcast. We have online courses. We have a long running newsletter. It's been going out for over 5 years every Monday. So we've built this kind of community of people that are also looking to improve their sleep. And we do have a particular niche in high stakes poker players. And so I share all that, not just to share all that, but because at its lowest, I was doing everything not to do for your sleep. And yet it's still available. And I'm really very clear on this fact that no matter where the listener might be at, no matter where you're at with your sleep, if it's kind of okay, or really struggling, or somewhere in between, that we can absolutely take things to the next level. It's this thing we do a third of our lives, on average 26 years are spent asleep, and yet sadly we're not thinking too much about it, or learning too much about it. And I think it's an opportunity to really look at it as this skill set that, like any skill, you can start at 101 and really up level from there.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because I don't think a lot of people make the connection to, oh, I'm tired during the day. Oh, I don't feel strong. To, okay, maybe it's a sleep issue. Maybe I'm not getting enough deep sleep. We have to stop normalizing pathology.
Yeah.
Like, when most people say something's normal, what they really mean, in my experience, is it's common. But
Yeah.
common and normal are two very different things. I mean, obesity is common. Autoimmune issues are common. It's not normal.
Mm.
And so, to optimize our health, like you said, we're all performing at something, whether you're a stay-at-home mom, a CEO, professional athlete, you got to optimize your sleep. And so I have a little bit of a sleep story myself. I have moderate sleep apnea, and I've had night lays on my posterior tongue. And
Mm.
I just interviewed Dr. Ellie Campbell, who is an osteopathic doctor in Atlanta. She's a friend of mine from Atlanta. And she focuses a lot on oral health and sleep disordered breathing. And so I just got fitted, and I've been wearing about a week, an appliance that brings my mandible down and forward.
Great.
And I use nasal dilators here. And at some point, I'm going to have a tongue tie release. So for the listeners, if you've seen an ENT, don't think you don't have tongue tie just because you saw an ENT and they didn't mention it. I saw ENTs my whole life, pretty much. Not one ever brought it up. I saw a airway centric dentist, board certified in airway medicine. And they're like, yep, you got tongue tie. I mean,
Yes.
5 minutes.
Ugh.
And so, I mean, if your tongue's sliding down your trachea, I mean, just think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. Your body, your brains and your body's trying to keep you alive. So it thinks you're dying. It's not, it's going to put you in fight or flight. You're going to be in a sympathetic dominant state. Then you're going to have anxiety during the day, which is going to further exacerbate sleep. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you're pointing to these topics, because one, I think often people will hear about optimizing sleep and it can feel like a nice to have or something kind of extra. And what you're pointing to is one facet of sleep, which is can go into the mechanics of sleep that so many people don't even realize are problems that they might be dealing with. Tongue tie, I'm sure people listening, they're like, what's a tongue tie? I mean, so there's that problem that people are dealing with. Not even knowing some of the things that can be done if they do have sleep apnea. The amount of people I've spoken to that are like, oh yeah, I have sleep apnea, but I don't want to wear a CPAP. So that's the end of that. Or yeah, I snore. I probably have it, but why bother? Because I'm not going to do any of those treatments. So, so it's becomes this component, and this is such a crucial aspect. And when we're talking about sleep disorders, there are ranked by Mount Sinai over 100 sleep-wake disorders that we know of, and so many people running around being undiagnosed or untreated. And so even just from that disordered perspective, that is so crucial. And you're pointing to also things that are relatively new for us to be discussing of actions we can be taking, things that we can be doing to support that sleep from a anatomy perspective. And then when you fuse that with some of these additional ways to optimize our sleep, then they can all work in beautiful harmony.
Absolutely. And, to that point, in order to get my insurance to cover my oral appliance, I had to first see a pulmonologist, an MD. And he goes, yeah, we saw you back in 2014. I said, yeah, I know. I was choking. I was waking up during the middle of the night choking. He goes, well, the test showed that you were snoring, but we don't always treat snoring. I'm thinking, and therein lies the problem.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
I mean, your O2 sats might go down to 93, 94. So technically, I mean, you may be okay in allopathic medicine's eyes, but you're going to have cellular hypoxia and you're not going to get deep sleep. And so, I had a biological dentist who's in Dallas, Dr. Tony Ingram on, and she does a lot of airway stuff as well. And we talked about the need for working on nasal patency
Yeah.
before using mouth taping. Do you have any
Yes.
thoughts on that?
Totally. So of course, I think there's pluses and minuses about the mouth taping wave that's come in. It's pointing to a very clear problem that so many of us are mouth breathing. Like, what is this about? Why is this becoming more of a phenomenon? What's the evolutionary change that's occurred? So getting that dialogue, that awareness is great. And there are cases where people will utilize things like mouth tape and they can have great, improvements. And yet, one of the concerns from the sleep community is, are we literally band-aiding a problem that's then stepping over undiagnosed sleep disorders like respiratory-based disorders like upper airway resistance syndrome, sleep apnea, et cetera? And now you, in some cases, can be making things worse if we are taking those steps and not addressing the root problem. And then there can be times where then if we are addressing, I've seen many, many clients that then they've got certain oral appliances that they're using or CPAP or some combination, and then they use mouth tape on top of that. But we're addressing the root issue.
Right. Absolutely. That's so well put. And you mentioned, being on the mechanical side of sleep disorders. I used to be on the polar opposite. I was just biochemistry.
Sure.
So, I mean, I'll rattle them off and then we can deep dive into them. High cortisol,
Yeah.
low growth hormone, low thyroid, hyperthyroidism, Hashimoto's, let's see, low oxytocin, low neurotransmitters like GABA, serotonin. All of those can contribute, as well as inflammatory cytokines. That's why, like with COVID, other pathogens, it stimulates interleukin 6, interleukin 1 beta, TNF alpha, and they can basically punch holes in the blood-brain barrier. And then the microglia in the brain get turned on. And short term, you get brain fog, anxiety, depression, confusion, memory loss. Long term, you get neurodegeneration. So
Absolutely.
dive into any of those that you like.
So a couple things. The point of neurodegeneration, I think that's one of the reasons on the plus side where we're starting to get this kind of sleep renaissance happening, presumably, or I like to think, or more interest at least in this area of sleep, is because of what is appearing to be enough dearth of evidence to support that there's some sort of correlation between poor sleep and neurodegenerative issues. And as we link that back to our understanding, or it's really only about a decade old, of this conversation of glymphatic drainage with the G versus lymphatic drainage. So glymphatic drainage being that process of kind of cleansing throughout, particularly deep sleep. And if we're not optimizing for that and setting up an environment to support that, particularly that first half of our sleep, then we can be cutting off some of the actions that could support that we're having that positive and supportive brain health. And on the flip side, if we're not doing that, then some of those issues of neurodegeneration, like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, et cetera. So where we really begin with sleep as a skill, every person we work with is wearing the Oura Ring, and they're doing that so that we can have some objective data to follow the changes that they're making, the interventions that they're putting into their lives, and then seeing what the results are. And the whole umbrella by which we are putting this kind of these protocols in place are under circadian rhythm entrainment. And I am of the real strong thinking that this will be a huge trend in wellness in the future. It's already an emerging trend, but I believe it will be even more mainstream in the future, because a lot of the things, like how you began this conversation too, or this piece around cortisol, for instance, one of the ways in which to balance these two hormones that, or attempt to balance these two hormones that relate to sleep, particularly being cortisol and melatonin of either sides of the coin, that kind of bookend of to start your day and end your day. One of the places to begin is to entrain our circadian rhythm in such a way that I think many people don't even know what this will look like, and don't know what some of the tenets are and the hierarchy of these tenets. So meaning that to entrain and strengthen this 24-hour cycle, the connection to the Earth's rotation, then in the past, we lived outside. And so that was kind of just taken care of. It was kind of handled. All your environmental cues aligned. But now that the average person is spending well over 90% of their days indoors, herein lies the problem. So how can we mimic the things that would have been happening outdoors in our indoor zoo-like, environments? And so often what we find is one of the zeitgeibers or time givers is about that sleep-wake timing, that consistency. And that's a great place to begin for entraining that strong cortisol pulse and getting it to hopefully be in that Goldilocks area of not too high, not too low. But having it pulsing at the same times and the right times each day. So one of the things I see, I literally was just on a call earlier today with a new client, and we looked at their sleep stats, and they'd had years of data, and their wake up times looked like I always often see, which is kind of somewhat ish consistent throughout the course of the week. And then the weekends come, and then they're all over the place. Because then they have this opportunity to kind of try to make up for this poor sleep, and now they're sleeping in, or there's long nap periods or whatever. So those coping mechanisms, what then we're left with is, even on the cortisol piece, then a moving out of that cortisol pulsing and not a strong indicator of what time it is and what to be doing when. So often it's like so basic and yet so powerful if applied, is this anchoring process to your day. So starting with the 7 days a week, consistent wake up time. And I know a lot of people listening are like, I'm pretty good with that. And yet we look at your stats, and so often that is not the case. And there's some blind spots around how inconsistent these things often are for a lot of people. And so we start with that 7 days a week anchoring of that consistent wake up time to entrain that cortisol pulsing. And then in alignment with that, we're layering in light therapy. So phototherapy, not just a nice to have, but a truly drug-like effect that occurs. And so we're getting ourselves physically outside each morning as close as possible to that wake up time. to help further facilitate turning off any of that melatonin and shifting over to that cortisol. And the very cool thing that seems to happen is then there's almost this invisible countdown clock that occurs of when that bright light exposure happens, and that resetting that master clock, then that connects to the time by which you'll get that melatonin pulse in the evening, and having that be consistent. One of the beautiful things about this is if you are to take this on, and usually it's kind of painful in the first couple weeks because a lot of people are used to the coping mechanisms of the sleeping in, or the kind of trying to make yourself deal with the fact that you've had or get through that insufficient sleep with other methods, whether it's like lots of coffee, you go to bed really early, you somehow make up for these problems. If you keep that level of consistency, then over time, then the automaticity of these rhythms is like the best gift you could have, because now you're starting to wake up at around the same time naturally, and then you're starting to get sleepy at around the same time naturally. The problems that so many people have when they come my way, often it's like, well, what do I do to fall asleep? How do I turn off my brain? What types of magical, meditation apps can I listen to? What types of supplements? And half the time, those are, thwarted efforts because you're not dealing with the core issue here. And now there are many zeitgeibers and time givers that are super important for us to understand, because they can give us the keys to helping to make this all happen with velocity.
Yeah, there's a great quote, and I think it's the first Rocky movie where he said, Nature is stronger or smarter than man thinks." It's
Love it.
simple yet profound. Like, our genetics haven't had time, and our biochemistry hasn't had time to catch up to our modern day lifestyles. Like, you're in the concrete jungle of Austin,
Yeah.
and it's Texas, but it's kind of more like, it is a major city. But if we look to nature, like my little pug, she's upstairs right now. Earlier, she goes out, she gets morning sun. Like, she goes to the door when she has to go out, she lays in the sun. If I
Yeah.
have my biomat turned on, she'll climb on it. Like, the things that
Love
she
it.
does naturally, like, she's not thinking through like what we're talking about,
Yeah.
but it feels good to her. And so I agree. The cortisol awakening response, morning sunlight. What do you have people do? Or like this morning, I had a little bit of sun. I know Huberman says if you stay out longer, you still, get some benefit because there are rays penetrating clouds. I had Ari Whitten on the show, and he mentioned the Spurdy lamp. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with that?
I am. So the Spurdy lamp is great. One that I actually like even a little better is the Chroma D, and the Chroma D, and they're both great. Don't get me wrong. So both are the benefits of both of those are that they can actually help you produce vitamin D from a lamp, which is novel in and of itself. Now the Chroma D also infuses more red light in there, which is a cool aspect, because if we think about what nature would have provided us, to that great quote that you mentioned, I love that. Nature would have provided us always with full spectrum light that would have been present with both the blue. You would never have blue by itself without being balanced with all these other beautiful rhythms or elements of the rainbow, including red. So Chroma does a great job with kind of blending that in there. Now, those are really important options, I think, for people to realize as it relates to if you're in kind of northern latitude locations throughout particularly different parts of the season. That's where this whole topic of chronobiology, the science of time and how time affects your biology, is so fascinating, and it can get so layered. And so understanding that we really should have different behaviors in different seasons if we were mirroring kind of our ancestors.
Right.
And right. And so in the winter, and especially if you are up in Canada, for instance, and it's say January, then this is an important time for us to realize that the strength of the sun is not as powerful during that period. So you might want to have some coping mechanisms, whether it's something like the Spurdy or the Chroma D or what have you, because vitamin D being so crucial to this whole conversation, and certainly for the hormonal balance, it's its own hormone, and yet it interacts with all of these other hormones, and is so part and parcel for our ability to even have great sleep for many reasons, but one very well-known one one is its connection to melatonin. And so if vitamin D is connected to serotonin and a precursor to melatonin, if we're devoid of that, or not devoid, but a low in that, and many people are, then we have a problem here. And yet instead of just like kind of lowering the range, which we see for many people of just what's acceptable, oh, well, we're all deficient, so let's just lower the range. Instead, we could treat this and look at this. And so things like that can make a big difference. But I would also say too, from a lifestyle perspective, one of the problems we're dealing with is that the average person, their average day is around 100 times too dim as compared to what it would be outside. And on average, 100 times too bright in the evening, even as compared to the brightest moonlight. And that is coming out of a scientific consensus that was released just this year, where almost 250 circadian scientists, referencing nearly 2,700 peer-reviewed publications, found that they are of the thinking that having warning labels on light bulbs when used at night is now called for because of just the simple, innocuous use of blue-laden lights at night is doing enough damage to our well-being, including certainly sleep in this conversation, but extending to things like obesity, reproductive disorders, psychiatric disorders, heart disease, cognitive decline, et cetera, et cetera. So this light piece is huge, and we spend time on this piece because it's the top most important Zeitgeber, and so it trumps some of these other ones that are also equally important, or also important, but not to the level that light dark is. For example, temperature is really impactful on sleep. For example, meal timing makes a big impact on sleep. Dr. Sachin Panda was one of our most listened to podcasts of this last year. He's also in Huberman, you mentioned. And so understanding that meal timing acts as a circadian cue is a big deal, but still not as impactful as light. Light always trumps. So you want to do your due diligence to learn about this area, because it's not as simple as just like, oh, okay, I guess just, turn on a light by day and make it a little dim at night. It's not like that, especially considering that in the United States, the incandescent light bulb was made illegal this year. So most of us are finding ourselves under LED lights that are very blue rich, and this is doing more than we realize to our melatonin than I think is kind of out there. It's like we have that knowing, oh yeah, I think blue light and sleep are not friends, but not getting to not only what this is doing to our sleep, but the ripple effect to other areas of our life, including our just experience of life, how our mental health is impacted, and the fact that some people are more sensitive to these changes than others. We are seeing things like bipolar disorder and its connection to and sensitivity to some of these timing pieces. So it gets really layered, and it's a big, big deal.
And the chroma D, how do you spell that?
CHROMAD.
Okay. Thank you for that, because I didn't know
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, they're a newer one, but Spurdy is amazing too. So the fact that, they're the only two that I know of that can actually help you produce vitamin D from a lamp. They're very powerful too. Like you can actually get sunburns from these. So they're not for the faint of heart. So you really want to be mindful of that, but they can really help support you.
Absolutely. And one thing, you've probably seen these articles, I'm sure, but they've tested people who were well over the blood alcohol limits, and they tested people who were sleep deprived. It was in a controlled environment. The people who were sleep deprived, their driving was more impaired than the people who were drunk.
Yeah. Oh gosh, totally. And so, it makes sense too, if we think about the fact that we're saying that we might be able to stave off, or, that's a dramatic statement, but we might be able to help support our brain health. If we're talking about neurodegenerative kind of correlations, things that we are doing 30 years in advance could support what our older self is having to deal with down the road. Well, it also stands to reason that our cognition is likely to be impacted also on the short term if it could be so, life altering as to deal with neurodegenerative issues. It stands to reason that our brain health is going to be impacted on the short term. And we see that in studies where we look at like error rates. So when people are, having to do certain tests and they're just making far more errors if they're sleep deprived. I think so many of us don't realize how many quick acting effects can happen even after just one poor night of sleep. I mean, we're talking about even the changes in our glucose regulation. If anyone has a CGM, you're likely to see that. Changes in emotional regulation, changes in anxiety levels, changes in, so if we talk about, that back to the error rates or, safety, we see car accidents, we see things like this happen after we change the clocks for daylight saving time, just 1 hour, then causing all of these deleterious effects, heart attacks, car accidents, etc. So it's really far reaching, and it behooves us to get curious about this thing that is so sensitive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I had Dr. Jack Wolfson, the paleocardiologist, on the show, and he talked about, when the time changes, how there's a significant increase in heart attacks,
Yeah.
strokes, TIAs, things like that. And so, what you're saying is that as sleep is a skill. So, if I were to come to you as a new client, we're going to work on my light environment and circadian entrainment. And then, what are the other areas that you guys touch on?
Yeah, so it's all done through the umbrella of circadian rhythm entrainment. So the first piece, and first we're of course from a perspective of behavioral change. Now, it can be great to learn all these things, but often if we're not actually implementing them into our lives, it doesn't even matter. It's just like, oh, you're collecting more information. Great. So we take the first week to really, one, get clear on our why that we're taking the time to do this. We do a lot of intake of getting a sense of like what things are like right now, kind of the state of the union of our sleep, and getting connected to our latest data around if they're new Oura Ring users or if they've been wearing it, kind of where that we're at the moment. Then we go over our overarching kind of thesis or protocols for this language and this language around circadian rhythm entrainment. So we have these things that we're going to address. So we start with light, dark, then we go into temperature timing, we go into meal timing and type, then we go into exercise timing and type, then we're going into thought timing, which is it's really a fascinating area in and of itself. As diurnal creatures, we're meant to be active by day and at rest at night. And our thoughts actually have a diurnal pattern that we're beginning to understand more and more about, which is an amazing element. And if you think about CBTI, that is that first line approach, a lot of that is rooted in the psychology of how we're thinking about our sleep, but also just how we're managing our thoughts, and how we're managing like our work life, how we're managing our social interactions and all of that. So that gets in there as well, to the point that there are even gadgets on the market like cooling gadgets that you put on your prefrontal cortex to cool, or put on your, as a headband type thing to cool the prefrontal cortex. So we find that chronic insomniacs seem to have a warmer brain matter than those counterparts who are able to fall asleep with ease. So it even gives more reverence to the types of thoughts that we're having. These hyperactive thought patterns are actually having physiological effects that are measurable, which is a really fascinating piece to give reverence to the types of thoughts we're having and to work on those. And then lastly, chronopharmacology, the timing of our drugs. So that looks like even as, just basic as our caffeine, our alcohol, our THC, prescription medications, our supplements and beyond. Nowadays, even plant medicine and what have you. And so where are we putting these things? Are they serving us? Are they not? And then kind of bringing it all together from a consistency piece, because the ultimate piece, and this is probably the one where people don't like to hear this, but it is so important, is that sleep loves consistency. And so out of all this, we're trying to make a lot of our habits and behaviors as consistent as possible, including those meal times, including the exercise times and the wake up times and all those things, and how the application of that, what that looks like, what are the obstacles that we're dealing with to bring those all into place. Throughout that process, we're doing a lot with things like HRV in particular to kind of get a sense of what our nervous system, how our nervous system is behaving, how well recovered we are, if we're seeing certain trends, what we can do to impact those things. We're bringing in particularly often, we always have the Oura Ring, but often CGMs, because we do see such a correlation of metabolic health and our sleep results. For many people, testing for different sleep disorders, certainly sleep apnea is a very common one that we might be addressing. And then protocols that we can bring in that many people don't even know about, like to your point around the snoring. I mean, so many people don't even know that you could have daytime treatments, like the Excite OSA is a new one that's just can speak to some of these things that people didn't even know were on the table to them. And then there's so many more. It's just wild. So we're addressing some of those things throughout that period. And then on the other side of that, getting to see the difference that is happening in their stats throughout that process.
That's amazing. It sounds extremely thorough, like you're addressing all the different facets versus take adaptogens to lower cortisol, take
Right.
phosphatidylserine to lower cortisol. Well, it's not always cortisol. And even if it is cortisol, what's driving the cortisol?
Right.
You know?
Totally. Absolutely. Because then, in the temperature module too, we might be bringing in things like, cold therapy and heat therapy. We might be bringing in different modalities that we might not have much kind of muscle around where they would go and the impact that they can make. And to your point, like, and there is a time and a place, of course, for supplements, but there's a reason we put it kind of further down the pike, because we find that that's often counterintuitive, the place that most people want to begin. And I get it. When I was struggling with sleep, like, just give me the pill to fall asleep. And the maybe bad news insight on the front end, but over time ends up being, hopefully a positive thing, is that so much of this is free. So much of this is behavioral and environmental in nature, and maybe a bit psychological. And so this whole element fused together can give you such a level of power around your sleep and get you back in the driver's seat, so that it's not, this thing that you're mystified by routinely.
Absolutely. And what's something you know today that you wish you would have known closer to the beginning of your journey?
Mm. Um, let's see. That's a great question. I think I would have liked to know, I think really truly living the distinction of growth versus fixed, because I think there was still this element that kept gnawing at me throughout that period with my sleep, if it were relating to sleep, was that something's wrong. Like I flipped a switch and now I can never sleep well again. I don't know what I did. Maybe I hit my head. I don't know. But I can't sleep like I used to sleep. It's just how it is for me. And this is the future. And like future tripping and being fearful that things were stuck like that. And I think it's so important for all of us to have in our bones that virtually everything in life, I think, is a skill, minus your, height maybe, or certain elements that we just have to accept. But a lot of our life is something that we can really train and get curious about. So no matter what might not be working. So in my case, it was around sleep, but it had its hooks into other things that weren't working in my life. As an entrepreneur, there were certain things that were just out of integrity with my business and management of different things. And so I really had to handle all of those things to then restore the workability in my sleep. So I think that was an important lesson on the other side. And actually a gift was the fact that while at the time the sleep issue felt like just so there's no silver lining, it turned out that it was actually such a blessing, because sleep now serves for me as a barometer of the workability of my life. So when it starts, coming out again, at different points, say if I'm traveling a bunch and then, oops, my sleep is I'm starting to get worse scores or what have you. It's a reminder to me, okay, I got to rein it in. Maybe I got to meditate a little bit more. I got to take some self-care. I got to put in some new structures, because it's never done. It's dynamic. And as your life gets bigger or certain changes happen, if you think it's just, case closed, that's never true. So it is that growth piece, and we have the opportunity to continue with mastery around these things.
That's a great answer and very well put. Where can people find you, find out more about your work?
Sure. Yeah. Sleepisaskill.com can act as a bucket to do a bunch of things. And it's my commitment that anyone who is interested in improving their sleep, that you can have some resources. So you go there, and one, you can take a free sleep assessment. So we put in like what you're dealing with your sleep, and then get immediately some resources back that are tailored to what you're dealing with. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter. Like I said, it's called the Sleep Obsessions newsletter. Really put a lot of passion into that one. And it's a great community, a place for us to kind of converse. So, reply back to that and what have you. We've also got weekly podcasts. So we've got different sleep experts in various areas, and putting different perspectives into the conversation of how to support this area of life. So that's coming out routinely. So lots of free things. We also have the optimized bedroom PDF downloadable option for free. So all these things that you can get no matter your budget. Now, if you are looking to improve your sleep beyond that, we have cohort groups like I spoke to kind of through that protocol. And we have those running routinely throughout the year. We have one-on-one options, and then a more kind of one-off option, if people just want to kind of just get a taste, is we offer things called the Oura Ring audits or Whoop Band audits. And so then we can hook up your sleep results, and we can go over those and give you tailored feedback to what you can do to improve upon your current, sleep results, and then see what comes out of that.
That's amazing. Well, you're doing great work. Keep up the great work. And you have a book that you're going to be working on, correct?
Yes, yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Still, there's still a journey in between where I'm at now and where it's going, but very excited about that because truly it's my mission on this planet to get this message out. I really think I dodged a bullet with the path that I went down, because I think I could have very easily continued to be taking sleeping pills and the whole world of it. And I've seen a lot of people go down that path and kind of derail a lot of what was possible for them. And so I'm just grateful that out of the circuitous, path of events that I went down, that I was able to avoid that. But I know so many people are at that crossroads for themselves right now, and I do not want to see that happen. And there's so many ways that we can actually, make friends with our sleep and support our sleep.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And hopefully we can have you back on in the future.
Yes. And thank you for having me on here and for creating this awesome platform and for sharing this information. It's really, really incredible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Molly, and have a blessed rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.